The presidential election of 1912 was one of the most tumultuous in U.S. history. The Republicans, who won 11 out of the last 13 presidential contests, were the dominant force in American politics. Nevertheless, in 1912, a Democrat, Woodrow Wilson, would take over the reins of power. In this video, I'll prove that Wilson's election was inevitable, even assuming Theodore Roosevelt never ran third party after failing to secure the Republican nomination. But to get to that, it is necessary to do, first, a brief rundown of the preceding history. On September 14, 1901, President William McKinley died after being shot twice 8 days before by an anarchist in New York. Then Vice President Theodore Roosevelt was quickly sworn in, becoming the youngest president thus far in U.S. history at 42 years old. Roosevelt would go on to win re-election in 1904, pledging amidst his victory not to seek a third term. Quote, "The wise custom which limits the president to 2 terms regards the substance and not the form. Under no circumstance will I be a candidate for or accept another term." Instead, Roosevelt ensured his Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, would become his chosen successor in the hopes that he would carry on his political legacy. And Taft would in fact win the 1908 election, beating the Democrat challenger, William Jennings Bryan. However, astute political observers were quick to notice that Taft lacked the energy and charisma that facilitated his predecessor's successful presidency. But most critically, Taft was definitively more conservative than Roosevelt, not sharing in his ambitious progressive vision. And so a fierce ideological split between the progressive and conservative factions of the Republican Party emerged, each mutually hostile to the other. This internal war was inflamed and cemented by the catastrophic 1910 midterm elections. The Republicans lost the House, which they had controlled for 16 years, to the Democrats, losing a whopping 57 seats, and further compounding this was the election of Democratic governors to more than half of the states. Needless to say, the once almost unstoppable party of Lincoln was showing signs of major strain. Roosevelt, acceding to the calls of his fellow progressives, announced his candidacy for the Republican nomination in early 1912. Even though he knew he was unlikely to beat Taft and privately preferred to have waited for the much more auspicious 1916 election, Roosevelt decided that on principle he must defend the progressive movement, win or lose. At the Republican National Convention, Roosevelt overwhelmingly won states whose delegates were determined through direct primaries, meaning by the voters. Unfortunately for him, the majority of states still chose delegates through state conventions, meaning by party leaders, who are beholden to the Taft administration. Roosevelt believed that Taft had hundreds of fraudulently selected delegates and demanded their immediate replacement. However, the Republican National Committee ruled in favor of Taft, prompting Roosevelt to bolt the convention altogether. Instead, Roosevelt founded a new party, the Progressive Party, nicknamed the Bull Moose Party. With Taft as the Republican nominee and the Democrats, for their part, nominating New Jersey Governor Woodrow Wilson, the 1912 election promised to be dramatic. Roosevelt was under no illusions about the quixotic nature of his campaign, writing that summer to his son, "Of course, I do not for a moment believe that we shall win. The chances are overwhelmingly in favor of Wilson, with Taft and myself nearly even, and I hope with me a little ahead." Okay, so now that we have got the relevant history out of the way, let's talk about the popular narrative around the election of 1912. Woodrow Wilson, of course, won, becoming the 28th president, carrying a landslide 435 electoral votes. That said, Wilson only had around 42% of the popular vote, a plurality over Roosevelt's 27% and Taft's 23% to be sure, but not an absolute majority. And it is here where we have our problem. It is obvious that Roosevelt acted as a spoiler to Taft's re-election effort, to some extent, but to how much exactly? It is exceedingly tempting to simply add the popular vote margins of Roosevelt and Taft, which would together comprise 50% of the popular vote total, and be enough to put them over Wilson in that regard. And this has been the popular analysis, that Taft would have won if Roosevelt never ran a third-party campaign and split the Republican vote. However, I think this is incorrect for 2 key reasons. The first one, as we do not elect presidents based upon the popular vote, but on the Electoral College, I argue that a proper analysis must necessarily be conducted on a state-by-state level, and not nationally. The second reason is I believe it is exceptionally unlikely that every voter who voted for Roosevelt would have voted for Taft. Let me elaborate as to why on the second point. Ideologically, Wilson was ideologically closer to Roosevelt than Taft was, at least in 1912. Wilson and Roosevelt were progressives, each emphasizing reform and advocating for things like direct primaries, conservation, higher taxes, and strengthening the federal government, as well as combating trusts and being more inclined to labor and workers' rights. In large, it could be said that Wilson and Roosevelt agreed on the issues and the need for reform, but differed in their opinions as to the best approach. While Taft, on the other hand, he did do plenty of trust-busting in his presidency on the whole, but he was anywhere from apathetic to disapproving of the other tenets of progressivism. Democratic Party rebrand. This point largely follows from the previous. As stated at the beginning of the video, the Democrats were on a consistent losing streak since the end of the Civil War. Leading up to the 1912 election, almost the entirety of the Democratic Party's distinction from the Republican Party was that the Democrats were anti-imperialist and opposed the gold standard. Well, sometimes, when they were not infighting over it. So all in all, not the most inspiring of platforms. However, as progressivist fervor grew in America, the Democrats began to copy-paste more and more progressive creeds into their identity. So, when the conservative wing of the Republicans effectively solidified control of the party, the disillusioned progressive Republicans could find a new home in a party amenable to their ideas. And finally, there's other political reasons. Throughout his term as president, Taft alienated the entire progressive wing of his party. Even before Roosevelt got involved, there was a nascent progressive movement to seriously challenge Taft for the nomination. There's really no way around it. Progressives were extremely unhappy with Taft and desperate for a replacement. Even assuming, for our purposes, that Roosevelt accepted his loss to Taft of the nomination, the optics would have been terrible for Taft. For starters, the progressives thought that Taft won only through corruption, but also publicly breaking with and disparaging the popular former president, Roosevelt, would have been almost insurmountable anyway. Other evidence that Taft would have lost. The 1912 congressional elections. Though people claim that Roosevelt and Taft split the Republican vote on the national scale, there was nobody to split the votes for Republican candidates in the House and Senate elections of 1912, which were quite literally happening at the same time as the presidential election. Continuing on the disastrous trend for the Republicans in 1910, in 1912, the Democrats gained an additional 62 seats in the House and obtained the majority in the Senate, granting them control of both chambers. Like I said, these down-ballot Democrat victories cannot be fully accounted for within the Republicans would have won if it weren't for Roosevelt narrative. So with all that evidence taken into account, I propose that a reasonable estimation of the amount of Theodore Roosevelt voters who, if he never ran third party, would have voted for Woodrow Wilson lies between 20 and 25%. In other words, I believe at least 20 to 25% of Theodore Roosevelt voters would have voted for Wilson, and 75 to 80% of them would have voted for Taft. So to get more specific into the methodology here, we'll define winning as having a vote share of 50% or greater within a particular state. So if Wilson would need under 20% of Roosevelt votes to win, I give the state to Wilson. If Wilson would need over 25% of Roosevelt's votes to win, I give the state to Taft. If Wilson would need between 20 to 25% of Roosevelt's votes to win, I've left that as undecided and have not given it to Wilson or Taft. Okay, so for our first map here, we have states that Wilson won outright. Or in other words, states that Wilson had over 50% of the vote share in and would have won in any circumstance. And these states include South Carolina, Mississippi, Louisiana, Georgia, Texas, Alabama, Florida, Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas, and Tennessee, granting Wilson 128 electoral votes. This next map shows states that Wilson had an insurmountable lead in and still would have won in any case. While he did not have 50% of the vote, he had more than the vote share of Roosevelt and Taft combined in these states, which include Kentucky, Oklahoma, and Arizona, granting Wilson with a total of 154 electoral votes. This next map shows states that Taft won outright. In the original election, Taft won these two states as well, those states being Utah and Vermont, granting him 8 electoral votes. But in this case of our simulated scenario, Taft would have won these states as well, meaning that Wilson would have needed over 25% of Roosevelt's votes to win. So in both cases, Taft would have won these two states. Okay, so this next map shows states that Wilson would have needed under 10% of Theodore Roosevelt voters to win, or in other words, under 1 in 10 voters. And these states include Maryland, Nevada, Indiana, and Missouri, leaving Wilson with a total of 198 electoral votes against Taft's 8 so far. And this one shows states that Wilson would have needed under 15% of Theodore Roosevelt voters to win, and these states include Delaware, Colorado, West Virginia, and Nebraska. leaving 223 to 8. And so this map shows states which Wilson would have needed under 20% of Theodore Roosevelt voters to win, or in other words, under 1 in 5 voters. And these states include New Jersey and Ohio, leaving Wilson with a total of 261 electoral votes against Taft's 8. And it is necessary to mention here that in 1912, the majority, or the amount needed to win the Electoral College, was 266 electoral votes, meaning that Wilson would need 5 more electoral votes to win the election. Here are the states that Wilson would have needed over 25% of Theodore Roosevelt voters to win, which means they are given to Taft. And those states include Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, New Mexico, North Dakota, Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois, Michigan, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, boosting Taft to 188 electoral votes, and Wilson is still at 261 with 5 more votes to secure his nomination. Okay, so there's 2 sort of special scenarios here revolving around the states of California and South Dakota. As you may have noticed, California has been yellow because in 1912 it had a split electoral vote system, meaning that more than one candidate could win electoral votes from the state. And in real life, this is what happened. Theodore Roosevelt won 11 out of the 13 electoral college votes from California, and Wilson won 2. But with both South Dakota and California, these states are a little bit odd in that Taft had very low presence. Theodore Roosevelt and Wilson were between 0.02 difference in California, and Taft was not on the ballot in South Dakota at all. So they are worthy of a little special consideration here. However, to that end, because, like I said, in California, Wilson and Roosevelt were 0.02 difference in vote, that leaves it pretty much impossible that Wilson would have lost the state if Theodore Roosevelt never ran, because, in that case, Wilson would have needed approximately 0.72% of Theodore Roosevelt voters to get him over the 50% threshold in that state. Likewise, in South Dakota, because Taft was not on the ballot and Theodore Roosevelt won the state with around 50% of the vote, that means that Taft would have needed almost the entirety of Theodore Roosevelt voters to vote for him. Or precisely, Woodrow Wilson would have needed around 8.39% of Theodore Roosevelt votes to win South Dakota. In either case, winning either California or South Dakota would put Wilson over the 266 electoral count threshold needed to win the election. Okay, so here we have on the left what actually happened in real life, in which Wilson won 435 electoral votes against Roosevelt's 88 and Taft's 8. And on the right, we have the simulated scenario, where, assuming Wilson would have won South Dakota and California, Wilson would walk away with 277 electoral votes against Taft's 180. Those 4 grayed-out states, Kansas, Wisconsin, New York, and Maine, are states in which Wilson would have needed between 20 and 25% of Theodore Roosevelt voters to win. But as we cannot precisely narrow down the exact percentage here, we're going to have to leave them gray, because it is uncertain for sure what would need to get Wilson over that threshold. Either way, no matter what, Wilson would still have over 266 electoral votes needed to win. So in conclusion, with the historical evidence, the vote totals in each particular state, I think that this is enough to at least seriously cast doubt upon the narrative that Taft's victory was assured had not Theodore Roosevelt ran third party, and that Wilson's victory might just have been inevitable. Alright, thank you for watching. I hope you have a good one.